Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming here today to celebrate the work of Doris Salcedo. This week, we opened this extraordinary exhibition that celebrates over 30 years of production of the work of Doris Salcedo, the largest survey of her work to be organized in the United States. And this show was organized by the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. It traveled to the Guggenheim and then to us. And I wanted to say that, Doris is a very ambitious artist with her work. She has a very precise way of installing her work, very demanding way, and it's been an exceptional experience for us as an institution to take on that ambition and to produce an exhibition that we feel is incredibly pertinent to our community, to our context, and very relevant today as we think about different parts of the world that are dealing with violence and trauma, which is what her work ultimately addresses. One of the things I wanted to thank or highlight or thank Doris with this exhibition is just that incredible rigor and magic with which she approaches she approached the architecture of this building. I think she managed to design an exhibition that dialogues with our architecture in a very particular way. And the rooms that she's created and the power of those rooms has a lot to do with how she positioned the walls that she built and her work within our building. And it really brings out the strength of what architecture and art can do when they work together so well. I wanted to thank our corporate sponsors, Verve Clicquot, Phillips, and Hogan Lovells, as well as the Consulate of Colombia for helping make this possible. I wanted to also thank several individuals who really stepped forward out of appreciation for Doris's work to support the exhibition. Several of our trustees, Patty and Bill Clay, who are with us here today. Thank you so much for all your support. Maria Bocelli as well, and Scott Hodes, as well as Nina Fuentes. We appreciate your support. Doris Salcedo was born in 1958 in Bogota, Colombia. She earned her BFA from the Universidad de Bogota Jorge Tadeo Lozano in 1980, and a Master's of Arts from New York University in 1984. Salcedo's sculptures and installations embody the silenced lives of the marginalized, from individual victims of violence to the disempowered of the third world. Often mournful in tone, her works are not memorials. She makes absence concrete. She talks about oppression and the gap between the disempowered and the powerful. While abstract in form and very open to interpretation, her works serve as testimonies on behalf of both the victims and the perpetrators that she references in her work. Her work reflects very much a collective effort. She works with a team of architects, engineers, and assistants, many of whom we worked with over the last 6 weeks on this project. As well as her work dialogues very much or is a collaboration with the victims of these senseless and brutal acts that she references. I would say that her work feels extremely relevant and pertinent in the context of Miami, a city that very much has ties to Colombia, ties to Latin America, and in both good and bad ways our histories are very much intertwined with many of the traumatic experiences that in Latin America over the last decades. And beyond that, her work very much transcends the specific context of Bogota to speak about how do we think about, how do we process trauma related to violence. There's a beautiful play between many dichotomies in her work between erasure and bringing to the surface these issues and processing through these painful experiences. I'd like to thank her again and just mention that it's been an extraordinary experience working with her, and we're so happy to have the exhibition here. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for being here today. I find it particularly difficult to talk about images in general, but even harder to talk about my work. I believe through words, art can never be fully grasped. In order to talk about my work, I need to approach it in an oblique way. And for this reason, I will borrow the words of thinkers and poets in order to open up a space in which I could bring here today the presence of my lifetime work. Derrida, Badiou, Nancy, Celan, to name just a few, will be present in every word I will read today. My entire talk should have quotation marks. I will present to you images of some of the pieces I have made in the past 30 years. I have produced all of my sculptures in the same place. I live in Colombia, as you know, a country still at war, and one of many epicenters of catastrophes today, one of many countries where catastrophe seems to be but a single continuous event. Zealously and stubbornly, I have remained working in the same place, which has been consistently described in negative terms as underdeveloped, third world, uncivilized, irrational, and brutal. The negative place from which I make my work has defined the negative history I need to address in these pieces. But this negative history can no longer be located at a specific country. My work not only comes from Colombia, it derives from turmoil and civil war, as Hannah Arendt wrote in 1963, quote, is raging all over the earth, unquote. Thus, my work could come from any of the many places where extreme violence goes rampant. It comes from when we find the trace of the tragic, where it is difficult to distinguish between war and peace, where the difference between soldiers and civilians has been effaced. Giorgio Agamben thinks that, quote, civil war marks a threshold of indifference where the political and the unpolitical, the outside and the inside collide, unquote. And this situation is no longer restricted to places defined as third world. The 21st century civil war is a war whose battlefront has disappeared. Now we find the front everywhere, and the attack can come from anyone. Death strikes at random, as in Sandy Hook Elementary School, or at a Charleston church, or in a small town in Colombia, or in Brussels, or at a Pakistani park. Undeclared civil war acquires different forms in different places, but the common element in all of them, as Agamben explained, is the fact that life as such has become the stake of politics. So, it is from this negative perspective that I have produced all of my work, driven by the obsessive need to render visible the experience of the most vulnerable and most anonymous victims of political violence. This negative perspective has confined my work into a fragile threshold, a threshold filled with impossible contradictions that will remain unsettled in each and every one of my pieces. I have come to believe that these contradictions and paradoxes constitute my work's very essence. And it is precisely about these contradictions that I would like to talk today. It is strange to hear about to be a talk of the work I have produced in the past 30 years, and yet with the absolute certainty that I am just a beginner who knows little of art. But on second thoughts, actually, there is nothing strange about this, because art is about not knowing. Art is a constant reminder of the fact that rules, norms, and acquired knowledge are insufficient to render visible those aspects of reality that, from the perspective of the establishment, should remain invisible, unnamed, and faceless. Art is not about knowledge. It exceeds knowledge. It is, as Kierkegaard wrote, about discovering something that thought cannot think, something impossible, something at the frontier of thought and desire. By now, I should be used to working from the unknown, since it is the situation in which I placed myself every time I start working on a new piece. But I am not used to it, because it is a disorienting, paradoxical, contradictory situation, appropriately defined by Kafka as universally impossible. In a letter to Max Brod, he stated the three impossibilities he faced as a Jewish Czech writer, writing in German, quote, the impossibility of not writing, the impossibility of writing in German, and the impossibility of writing any other way, to which, he says, he is tempted to add a fourth, the impossibility of writing, unquote. Impossible is a word that defines for me the creative art, an act in which, as Jacques Derrida instructed us, one should only do what is impossible. That ought to be the impossible rule. Art's main task is to open up the possibility of the impossible. And for this reason, art exceeds us. According to the philosopher Alain Badiou, it is what exceeds the stable borders of the presently possible. Art exceeds knowledge, and specifically the knowledge or present understanding we have of what it means to be human. The poet Paul Celan thinks that in every work of art, even in the least ambitious, there is this ineluctable question, this exorbitant claim. For Celan, art is the impossible path an artist must follow. Art is en route towards a you that is constantly fading away from our grasp. And art attempts to make possible this impossible encounter. Working with art is synonymous of working with the impossible. The impossible is present in everything I do. Derrida stated that a work begins by the impossible, not with the impossible, as with some initial inquiry that seems impossible, but rather pushed or shocked into action by the impossible. The impossible pushes its way into my work when, against all odds, grass grows underneath a wooden table, or when a shroud is made of rose petals that do not wither, or when it is necessary to build a wall downwards instead of the usual upwards. Sometimes my task seems impossible because each time I need to make a different, radically different piece to honor the singularity of each and every victim's experience. So different, I need to go from animal fiber to stainless steel, from extremely heavy to immaterial. As you can see from these images, I do not accumulate knowledge. Every single time I begin working on a new piece, my point of departure is a tabula rasa. Every single piece I have ever made has always begun with the testimony of a victim of political violence whose experience is a requirement for the very existence of my work. And for this reason, from the beginning, I agree with Deleuze's belief that artists must be forced into an exercise of depersonalization in order to produce works that are far removed from the autobiographical and strongly connected to a political immediacy. The philosopher Alain Badiou goes even further when he argues that an artist's desire needs to be articulated from the point of view of the location of each individual in relation to a specific traumatic experience. The poet Paul Celan considers a similar idea in his text, The Meridian. He writes that an artist is he who has forgotten all about himself. And in this manner, art moves with the oblivious self into the uncanny and strange. And later, on the same text, he argues that only the artists who speak from an angle of reflection, which is their own existence, their own physical nature, can reach the mystery of an encounter. My work is based on experiences I lack. Therefore, it is made from an unfamiliar, unstable place, simultaneously strange and proper. It is made from an indirect perspective, a place of insufficiency from which a fragmentary, incomplete history is precariously told and retold. The place from which I have tried to produce my work is extraordinarily presented in this poem by Osip Mandelstam that I will read to you. What I am saying now is not being said by me. It's dug from the earth like grains of petrified wheat. For Badiou, a poem like this subtracts language from the manipulations of knowledge. It liberates art from habits, conventions, and cliché. He believes that art that speaks from the perspective of the unknown is the only one capable of speaking of our time. Paradoxically, the power of this kind of art for Badiou resides in the weakness of its sense, in the fact that it has withdrawn from the plenitude of sense. He writes, quote, "When one is ready to be outside of oneself, one will be able to speak poetically from a terrestrial anonymity, destined from everyone. At this point, the addresser either becomes absent or becomes plural," unquote. What counts are the works, the experiences they address, and not who made them. In spite of the fact that the work always proceeds from a specific life experience, I need to create in each piece a radical silence. I believe art stands at the paradoxical intersection of silence and eloquence. Every one of my pieces goes towards a victim, but during the process of making a piece, I have to make sure I keep a distance in order to leave that person intact, untouched. The work departs from the singularity of a life experience that is linked to suffering and pain. But once these experiences become part of a work of art, they should become silent and strangely neutral. In all of my work, I have addressed only one issue: political violence. I have focused on political violence because I strongly believe violence defines the ethos of our society. Violent death marks the passage of a complete life into the industrial production of corpses that has characterized the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. Death at an industrial and epic scale, but at the same time reduced to its utmost insignificance, trivialized, and as such inscribed into our normal everyday life. I believe art, on the other hand, can inscribe in our life a different kind of passage, that is, from suffering to signifying loss. And it is for this reason that for the past 30 years, I have remained immersed in mourning, and my work has been the work of mourning. Palimpsest, the piece I am currently working on, deals specifically with mourning. In this piece, the ground cries drops of water that will join together to slowly write the names of those victims whose lives this society refuses to grieve. Each victim of violence has a name that we owe to name. Badiou thinks that the only name available for the great majority of people is excluded. Excluded is the name of those who do not have a name. For him, philosophy, and I would like to add art, has no other legitimate aim than to help find the new names that will bring into existence the unknown, forgotten victims. I think it is important to create this kind of art because, as Jean Améry reminded us, quote, the aesthetic view of death reveals an ethic view of life. When the aesthetic view of death collapsed, Auschwitz becomes possible. An aesthetic view of life gives us back the dignity and humanity we lose every time a violent death takes place. I believe this kind of work plays a role that is quite similar to the funeral oration, and it begins at the same moment, the instant Derrida calls the end of the world. A person who's no longer here is addressed at the moment when she or he can no longer hear us, and the address takes place when there remains nothing to be said. This salutation, or final adieu, according to Jean-Luc Nancy, gives the ruined world its dignity as world, and to the proper name, deprived of sense, it gives the totality of sense. I see my work as a topology of mourning, the only possible response I can give in the face of irreparable absence are images capable of conveying incompleteness, lack, emptiness. A work of art, as funeral oration, explores possible ways in which to formulate a poetics of mourning that not only affirms the work of mourning, but it is what Norigana calls a work in mourning. It attempts to give back the sense, meaning, and form that violence took away from its victims. And Nancy adds that these poetics of mournings also give rise to that strange turmoil of crossing through life for nothing, but not exactly at a pure loss. I have devoted myself to creating images of mourning, since images are all we are left with once a beloved person has been taken away by a violent act. But in the case of political violence, these are not the only ones we are left with. Jean-Luc Nancy writes that violence always completes itself in an image. It always makes an image of itself. What matters in the exercise of force is the production of the effect that one expects from it. The violent person wants to see the mark he makes on the being he assaults, and violence consists precisely in imprinting such a mark. Violence imprints its image by force. In my work, I have tried to inscribe violent death without ever repeating or reproducing the violent act itself, but rather responding with images that differ essentially from it, because I think it is important to generate images that oppose the symbolic hegemony violence imposes on us. To find the limit of the representation of violence has been an essential part of my work. The question is how to present violence in a work of art without violence? How can I generate images that do not reproduce the violent act while addressing it? Jorge Luis Borges has given me a possible answer. He writes that, quote, "The imminence of a revelation that does not come about is perhaps the aesthetic fact." Borges' definition of art allowed us to conceive of ways to present in art violence without violence. This consists precisely in the revelation not taking place, in its remaining imminent. This type of image is the opposite of violence, which reveals completely. Violence is hyper-representation, as Hollywood and authoritarian regimes all over the world know very well. Marie-José Monzén said that the greatest sites of vision in Western art harbor a concept of the image that demands a void at the heart of its visibility. What makes a work of art is, quote, "that epiphany in absence that only occurred during an eclipse," unquote. For her, the image a work of art presents should be like an eclipse. Quote, "What is an eclipse? An object comes between the viewer and the sun and darkens the world of empirical forms while its outline is illuminated by the fire that it hides, but whose brilliance we are momentarily able to contemplate," unquote. This brilliance that we are momentarily able to contemplate is the only image art can give. For her, the sense a work of art presents is sense eclipsed, and the image should be an eclipsed image. Nancy establishes a difference between being there in the world and being image. The image a work of art presents is not there, but over there in a distance, and this distance is called absence. In this sense, he writes, that contrary to what is commonly believed, the imagination of an artist does not reside in the faculty of representing an object or a person in its absence. On the contrary, imagination is the force that draws the form of presence out of absence. The absence of the imagined subject is nothing other than an intense presence. The experiences I try to address are not anecdotes. My work is not about experience taken from life. It is about the memory of experience, always vanishing. It is the vacuum generated by forgetfulness. The work of art is concerned precisely with that which is not an event. It points towards an event, or as Nancy said, in a work of art, an event, an eternity coincide in the intensity of its image. The events my work addresses are in the process of appearing and disappearing. Therefore, they can never be fully present. As Derrida says, art articulated what is no longer and what is not yet. These sculptures are the only locus where these distant events take place. My work is a vain attempt to recover the irretrievable. More than inert, silent pieces, I see these furnitures full of concrete as acts, hopeless actions, as though one could amend reality. In them, different times are juxtaposed because the time of violence, as Hamlet said, is out of joint. It is a dislocated time, and in a way, it is in this disjuncture of time that a work of art can open up a space in which to bring into our present the repressed and forgotten presence of the victims of the past. And yet, I could summarize my work with one word: impotence. My work is a sum of impotences. Not being able to solve anything, lacking the capacity of fixing anything, not seeing, not being able to reach a presence. In the aftermath of violence, we are caught between hope and impotence. And I hope in this piece and land, this twofold experience is present, suggested by the difficulty of not seeing clearly. And this difficulty bears with it the feeling of proximity, maybe the proximity of an almost possible presence, but however, there is only absence. I have tried to inscribe in my work precisely, I have tried to inscribe my work precisely in the threshold where this absence makes itself present. In spite of the fact that I am a sculptor working with solid matter, I perceive this fragile threshold as something untouchable, like an image or a wound. A flor de piel is concerned just with this untouchable aspect of a wound. A flor de piel started with the simple intention of making a flower offering to a victim of torture in an attempt to perform the funerary ritual that was denied to her. The genesis of a flor de piel arose when I began to wonder, how could I initiate even the slightest movement towards a tormented body? If only to present my flower offering. At this point, I began looking for the most fragile way of touching the untouchable. The process of making this piece pushed me to find the limits of the fragile and the most delicate within the frame of sculpture. The elaboration of a flor de piel represented a difficult challenge, trying to maintain a rose petal in a stage that is neither dead nor alive. I treated them so they remain suspended between the reign of the animate and the inanimate. I needed a shroud made out of rose petals that are simply sutured to one another. To me, making this piece represented the unattainable aim to shroud the extension of bodies torn away from life and never properly delivered to death. This is a delicate and almost insubstantial piece. In a certain way, what defines this piece is our gaze, our relationship with it. It is a thin shroud, an interface that makes possible the idea of coming close to touching while making evident the impossibility of a caress, of healing, and of saving from the abyss of death. Violent death lays beyond the scope of art. Mourning writes that death cannot be represented because it is the ultimate profanity, and as such, it escapes all symbolizations. Death is not representable, and for this reason in art, quote, it is substituted not by the category of emptiness, but of hollowing out. Its content, argues Mourning, should be emptied out to allow it to appear anew in the time and space of the sacred. Perhaps what art could represent is the death of death, and this is precisely what I hope to attain with Plegaria Muda. Our society generates margins and exclusions in which it places the part of the population that in the eyes of the administrative power are perceived as surplus, redundant populations. This population is forced to dwell not only in the periphery of cities, but on the periphery of life. They inhabit the most external border of humanity, and there they remain displaced from the human genre. The process of investigating this work began in 2004 with a trip around Southeast LA, where I found an official report which stated that over 10,000 young people had suffered violent death on the streets of the city over a 20-year period. I focused my attention on the violence caused by gangs, and particularly on the murky relationship that is established between the role of the victim and the role of the killer. After reflecting on this, I realized that this perverse and fluid swap between roles was possible because both inhabit an undefined gray area, which some writers have called social death or death in life. Social death is experienced by people living in deprived areas under precarious conditions. Its consequences are tragic. One can easily see the connection that exists between the so-called social death and the subsequent violent, anonymous, physical death. The conditions that generate these social deaths are quite similar all over the world, whether in LA or in Bogota. Plegaria Muda is also a response to a particular event that took place in Colombia between 2003 and 2009, in which 2,500 young people from deprived areas were murdered by the Colombian army and then presented as, quote, unidentified guerrillas discharged in combat, unquote. The death of each young person generates an absence that demands that we take responsibility for those who are missing, since the only way they can exist is within us. Our relationship with them does not end with their death. It lives on as grief. Hans-Jos Frey argues that in the face of death, the end of our hope survives as mourning, as a sign of the infinite incompleteness of our relationship with the death. Colombia has been the country of the unburied dead. We have hundreds of unidentified mass graves where the dead remain nameless. For this reason, I needed to inscribe the image of the grave in this piece, creating a memorial, a graveyard, in which to open up a space a space for each body. Plegaria Muda highlights each tomb individually, despite not being marked with a name. Each piece has been sealed and has an individual character, as if to indicate that a funeral ritual has taken place. The implacable and obsessive repetition of the tomb emphasizes the painful repetition of this unnecessary death. I hope that in spite of everything, life might prevail even in difficult conditions as it does in Plegaria Muda. Now I will present a few public art pieces I have made in the past 15 years in different locations and addressing different events. I made this piece based on the violent season of the Colombian Supreme Court on November 6th and 7th, 1985. A guerrilla commando took by force the building of the Supreme Court. The army retaliated in an equally brutal way, and as a result, a two-day total war broke up in Bogota's downtown. Approximately 120 people died, including the justices. On the 6th and 7th of November 2002, I presented this ephemeral work on the facade of the new Palace of Justice. This act of memory began on November 6 at 11:35 a.m., time when the first victim a guard of the building was killed. At that instant, an empty chair was slowly lowered along the southeast side facade of the Palace of Justice. This action was repeated several times for 2 complete days, the duration of the battle. The idea is to present an image that comes near the existential realities of death, loss, and emptiness, the legacies of war. This piece presents an image that respects the tension between remembering and forgetting in which the survivors and families struggle year after year. The piece I made for the Istanbul Biennial is a topography of war, inscribed in the midst of everyday life, an image where the private and the political collide, producing a complete sense of disorientation. The piece presents a sealed, circumscribed, and airless image. It is an intense, incessant piece, compulsively inscribed into an opening. On making emphasis on the flat surface, the stress is placed on the detail, and what is offered to the view is a proliferation of detail. The more you look, the more you understand that this scrutiny is useless. The piece is made with 1,550 chairs that intercept up to the point where both logic and order collapse. W.G. Sebald poses a question about how to form a language in which terrible experiences, capable of paralyzing the power of articulation, could be expressed in art. I asked this question to myself when making this piece. How to find a way to address concentration camps, both historical ones and their contemporary versions? How can we live a tranquil, peaceful, happy life, knowing of the existence of concentration camps today? This piece is an attempt to find an answer to these questions. Neither is a piece about uncertainty and ambiguity. I wanted to juxtapose an interior space with the utmost image of exteriority, wire mesh. It is an interior space that negates the possibility of interiority, intimacy, and remembrance. Space is a fundamental category for any form of power. Architecture represents its potency, its social order, and its objective. Architecture of power is made explicit in this room at the Castello de Rivoli. I thought this room had an absolute and totalitarian character. The piece I installed in it emphasized both the form and the character of this grand space. It was clearly a space of political practice, and this remains evident today, more than a century and a half after it ceased to be a center of power. A piece is a tool to decode the history and nature of this impressive and at times unapproachable space. Abyss addresses the sheer extra weight the power for one exert over this enfranchised population by simply building a wall downwards and then stop it just before the space becomes totally entombed. We know the worst moments of history has been defined by racial hatred. The rejection of the immigrant marks the trends towards separation, disintegration, and racism, and this is the space Shibboleth intends to delineate. Shibboleth, whose charge has always been to determine who can cross and who should die in the attempt, is placed here to mark the unbridgeable gap that separates humanity from infra-humanity. The piece is about absolute indifference. No cultural ornament attenuates the desolation and destitutions it is addressing. This piece is inopportune and apparently out of control. Its occurrence seems to be the product of an irrational event crossing through a rationalist building. Its appearance disturbs the museum in the same manner the appearance of the immigrants disturbs the consensus and homogeneity of European societies. Although I'm well aware of the fact that a critique of immigration is nothing new, I simply wanted to address this issue from the perspective of art, analyzing the role art played in the formation of the stereotype of human beauty. Western art constructed a radiant image of whites against the erased figure of all other peoples. In spite of the fact that these pieces are quite different from one another, there is one element that remains constant in all of them. And unwavering faith in art's ability to affirm the necessity of not remaining silent, even when addressing, as Mike Ball says, those issues of which one cannot speak. But faith in art must be understood as an act, and it is through this act that I have been able to think of unthinkable experiences. The making of my work is like a solitary liturgy where the unbearable, the unknowable, and the impossible are accepted and forged into images capable of generating the yes, yes with which Derrida defines faith. For him, faith is a general affirmation by which we all respond to the language before language, which must be repeated from moment to moment to give us a reason to live on. Thank you. Thank you. Are we taking questions?
Will you take a few Doris will take a few questions.
And we're recording, so
Mics on either side, so we are recording, so just wait for the mic. But
and if you'd like to leave, if you could just exit from the bottom here. Later, we'll have a single file line to enter the exhibition. But let's take a few questions.
Thank you so much, Doris, for coming to Miami. I'm right here. Really just love your work. I have a question regarding your role as a feminist. Do you consider yourself a feminist artist? I know a lot of the shoes in Atrabiliarios are feminine shoes, are women's shoes. A lot of your work has to do with domesticity, the furnishings, etc. So I'm wondering how you see your role as a feminist artist in our world today.
Yeah. Yes, I do consider myself a feminist, but when in terms of genre, I prefer to think of the human genre. I like to think of that all of us, that we're equal. And I don't like to isolate any specific experience of suffering, because I think we all suffer just the same way. So it is important that the work is open enough that it encompasses, it's able to embrace the experience of every single human being, hopefully. So I don't like to isolate. In some cases, like in Atrabiliarios, you have the experience of women being there more present than the experience of men, because in that particular occasion, the research I was doing indicated that the suffering of women had been extended There was not only the usual torture and killing, but then he was raped in between. So it happened through a longer period of time. Therefore, the torment was extended, and that's why there are more female shoes in that piece.
Thank you, Doris Salcedo, for your words for the show. I do think that in a world ravaged by conflict, violence has become indeed very normalized, and I believe your work dynamites that normalization, so thank you very much. I have a question, and just considering the recent peace process in Colombia, I wonder whether this political process has sparked any new creative changes into your work, especially considering that the construction of peace has to be not only political, but should have a cultural and aesthetic correlate. So just a thought, whether it has changed your work in a way. Thank you.
I think the peace process is extremely important. Absolutely, I have followed it, I have studied it. I think it's very important, it's essential for us. It's a very necessary step that Colombia must take and hopefully will take. But it will change nothing in terms of my work, absolutely nothing, because the experience of the victims will remain unchanged. Hopefully we will have less victims in the future, but it's not, but Colombia, after signing the peace process, will not achieve social peace because there is huge inequality. And so social peace will never be there for us, or at least for a long time. So the work that I have to do continues exactly the same as it was before. It won't change. I have a responsibility towards the victims, and I remain faithful to them. Derrida said that faith is always involved with the faith of the other. And so my faith in art continues being involved with the faith of the other. Thank
you. Doris, hello, my name is Patricia. I have a curiosity because for years and years and years, I was thinking about how it was the process to put all that chairs together between that buildings. How does it work? You know?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, you put that 1,500 chairs between the buildings.
Yeah.
And I would like to know the process. How many days? How does that work? Because for me, I stayed with this doubt for many years.
Well, I think it is important not to isolate the technical aspect of the making of a piece with its content, with its meaning, because if the making is difficult, it also relates to the difficulty of everyday life processes. We built a building. It has foundations, it has structure, and then we built the building. It is solid from front to back and from bottom to top. And we were just building it. Just that instead of using the usual bricks and whatever to build a space that can be inhabited, we built the space that cannot be inhabited, the space of displaced people. So it was completely filled with chairs.
Hi, Doris. Thank you so much for your amazing work. And I have a question that I hope nicely follows the previous one. For me, some of the moments in your work that are the most poignant, and this is perhaps as a fellow maker understanding how difficult it is to achieve such sensitivity at the moments where there are connections between materials, or when one material penetrates into another material, perhaps. And so, for me, those are levels in your work where such amazing craftsmanship is achieved. But I think that there's also something else going on at those moments that's far beyond craftsmanship and has a lot more to do with something else beyond the making of the piece. And I was wondering if perhaps you could speak a little bit to those moments of juncture and whether or not they speak to other things beyond the actual materials and the craftsmanship that we're seeing.
Well, I think you gave the answer in your question already. As I was saying in the talk, the making of the piece is like a liturgy. And it's not just technical. It's not a technical making. I have to be thinking that I am not myself when I do it. I play a role that it's like my center is in the center of the victim, and the victim's center is in my center. So it's like kind of schizophrenic moment, and from that point is that I work. From that perspective is that I work. So it is not a technical making; it's a liturgy, and that's why the materials acquire. They are removed from the physicality, and I hope they acquire a different level. I cannot be more specific. I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Carrie Ware, and Henry Matisse lived through both World War I and World War II. Never showed any human suffering in his work. I was wondering if you'll ever celebrate the joy and the beauty of life.
I think I do by making art. The fact that a person that is alive and that is thinking and that is seeing suffering makes art is a response that is full of joy of life. That's what art is.
Hi. I was wondering what the process in terms of like research and just coming to like the images that you represent, what that looks like.
The what?
The specific process that you have for some of these pieces in terms of deciding how you want to represent the ideas and which ideas specifically you want to convey.
Well, I think that there are some ideas that are myth that I don't believe in, like the creativity and the freedom of the artist. I don't believe in that. I think we have a responsibility. And so there are some events that are so important and that are so moving that I have no option but to address them. So they are imposed on me by reality. When a massacre takes place, when something terrible takes place, it's not of my choosing. It simply happens, and I'm responsible, and I have to respond with responsibility, respond to these terrible events. I think the notion that the artist is a free, creative person who can do as he or she wants is a really misrepresentation of what being an artist is. If you're an artist, you have to be humble. And you simply obey to what is happening around you. There's no other way of working. And then I start researching with absolute rigor and humility. I have to follow the path of the victims. I have to understand everything as much as possible. And then when I have as much information as I can possibly gather, then I start the process of making the piece, which is not exactly rational. And for that reason, I cannot describe it. Thank you. Thank you.